Hi, welcome to the Pluralsight course on how to build machine learning models with the Azure Machine Learning Designer. In this module, we're going to learn how to use the Designer modules to define a pipeline data flow. We'll do this by defining what a module is in the Azure Machine Learning Designer, and then we'll get an understanding of when to use them. So what are modules in Azure Machine Learning Designer? Modules are a way to perform actions on a dataset. It has a drag and drop capability that allows you to just drag a module and place it on the Designer platform. For better understanding of this, if you remember in the last module, we created datasets. Now to use the Designer, you will drag these datasets onto the Designer platform, and the next thing you want to do is perform actions on these datasets to reach the end goal, which is to build a model. And the way to perform these actions is with modules. So let's go through some of the top modules we'll use in the Azure Machine Learning Designer. First, we have the select column in dataset. This comes in handy if you want to choose specific columns. You can use this module for that. You can also clean data with the clean missing data module. You also have a split data module and a train model module. That's a bit difficult to say because they sound very similar. This is a very important module because when we get to the part of the course where we want to build our modules, using the train model module will come in very handy. And last, we have the execute custom code module. This is another very useful module if you already, for example, have a Python script you would like to run upon a dataset. Let's go through a scenario to better understand using modules. Let's say the question is, I want to find out how much a car will cost. How can I do this inside of the Azure Machine Learning Designer using modules? First module I'm going to need is the dataset module. And what this is going to do is connect to a registered dataset. And as you guys have seen, that dataset could be a CSV file, open dataset, or a SQL file, or any of the other data stores that we have inside of the Azure Machine Learning Studio. In the Designer, you have your data set. You realize you only need a few columns for your model to be efficient. So then you go ahead and select the columns you need. And next you find out some of the cells are missing data. The clean and missing data module will be the module you want to use. And what this module does is it gives you the option to use different methods to combat the issue of missing data. You can either replace the missing data with a placeholder, like an average of all the values in a column, or maybe using the median. You can also just remove the rows and columns with the missing values. Next step in our quest to get this question answered using the Azure Machine Learning Designer, we want to normalize the data. So what does that mean? Normalizing the data. As you might have guessed, there's a module for normalizing the data. And what this does is it puts your data on a scale of 0 to 1. This makes it a lot more easier to tell the order of your data set if you're working with smaller numbers like 0 and 1, as opposed to working with, let's say, 10,000 to 100,000. You can normalize the data on a single column or multiple columns. And this is also a requirement for some algorithms to model the data accurately. Now, the next step we want to use is the split data module. And what this does is it splits the data between test and train. And this is another requirement when building your machine learning model. Another module we want to use is the train data module. And this is very useful when using classification or regression algorithms in your model. With this scenario, we can see the data pipeline that can be used to create a model within the Designer to answer our question in this scenario. Now that we understand a bit better how modules work in Azure Machine Learning Designer, let's also go through a demo as well. We'll do this by running different modules on a dataset. We'll review some common modules, and we'll run the Designer pipeline to view the results. Back in the Azure Machine Learning Studio, I'll go ahead and click Start Now under the Designer. And on this page, I'll click the plus sign to create a new project. On the top here, I'll edit it and call it Demo Module Project. And I'll go ahead and collapse the sidebars to gain some real estate. On the left-hand side, you can see we have the Assets tab. And right now, there are about 98 assets in total. They are grouped in different categories, and these categories make it easier to navigate around the assets when you're trying to find the most relevant in order to take some actions on your data set. You can see assets as synonymous with modules because when you hover over an asset, you can see some description about the assets with the ability to click Learn More. And if you click Learn More, it will take you to a Microsoft documentation where it refers to these assets as modules. So back in the designer, the first assets I'll need is the dataset. You can see some of the datasets from our previous modules, but for this demo, I'm going to choose from the sample dataset group. And this will be similar to the car scenario I had in the last video. The dataset I'm going to choose is the automobile price data. Go ahead and drag it onto the screen. And we can see what's in it by right-clicking the dataset and click Visualize and then Dataset Output. We'll see here that we have a list of columns and rows, 26 columns and 205 rows to be exact. Looking at this dataset, one column I know I'm not going to use is the normalized losses column. And I'm going to take it out because I do not care as much for it for the model that I'm trying to build. So how do I go about doing this? So this leads us to the next module that we're going to need. And this module is called the Select Columns in the Dataset module. This will fall under the data transformation. Go ahead and open it up, and it should be closer to the bottom because the assets are grouped in an alphabetical order. Drag it over to the designer and connect it to the dataset. Now to select the columns, click Edit on the far right hand side, and a screen will pop up over here. And what I want to do is select the columns by name. And since I'm adding most of the columns, I'll select all the columns and then unselect the one that I do not want. Press Save, and we can now move on to the next piece. And the next thing we want to do is making sure the data has the highest integrity, which means we want to make sure the data is as clean as possible, meaning there are no missing values. If there are any missing values, we'll deem the entire row unusable and take them out. To do this, we'll need to bring in the data transformation assets called Clean Missing Data. Let's go ahead and look for it and drag it over. Connect it to the module we were just working with called Select Columns Assets. And like the last module, we're going to go ahead and edit the column section. And what we want to make sure is that all the columns are being cleaned in this data set. So go ahead and select Include All Columns and then press Save. And a little further down, you notice something called the cleaning mode. And as we said, if there are any missing data, we want to take out the entire row. And to do this, under the cleaning mode option, we want to make sure we are selecting the Remove Entire Row option. Moving on to the next module, we want to make sure that we split the data between test and train. And the split data module is also under the data transformation group. Go ahead and drag it onto the clean data. And if you notice here, the clean data has two options, one on the left hand and on the right side. The left hand side has the clean data, and that's the one we want to connect onto the split data module. There's a section called Fractions of Rows in the first output data set. By default, the data is split 50-50, but for this module, we're going to split it 70-30, meaning 70% will be on the left hand side and 30% on the right hand side. You can always change this to the percentage that suits you for the model you're trying to build. Now that we've added a few assets to the designer, it's important to check in to make sure that everything appears the way we're imagining it. So let's go ahead and run this by clicking the Submit button. Once you do that, you'll be asked to add a compute to make sure this project runs successfully. Go ahead and hit the Select Compute Target option, and we'll go ahead and select the compute that we created early in this course. If you deleted it, go ahead and create a new one. I'll go ahead and choose mine and press Save. Go ahead and press Submit again. And this time, it's going to ask us to create an experiment to accompany the project. I'll go ahead and call mine Demo Modules Experiment. And now we should be good to go. Keep in mind this process might take a while, so I'll go ahead and continue once this is done. We can see here that some of the modules have completed. So let's go ahead and look into the modules that we added to the data sets to make sure it looks exactly like we expect. First, we have the select columns in the data set. Right click on it, visualize, and view the results. We can see here that the column has changed from 26 to 25. That looks correct because we only took out one column. Next to the Clean Datasets option, if you look on the Visualize tab, we can see here that we have 193 rows and 25 columns. This tells us here that the difference received between the rows are the rows that had missing data, and they were eliminated as we instructed it to do. And last, we have the split data. Again, we'll go into the Visualize section, which will show us a preview of what the data looks like. And what we expect here is to see the first result to have 70% and the next result have 30%. This looks pretty accurate. Another module I'd like to demo is the Execute Language module. Azure Machine Learning has Python and R as languages to use. This allows you to leverage the designer's drag and drop features while still having the capability to write code against your dataset. Still in the Azure Machine Learning Designer section, I'll quickly create another pipeline to show you an example of how the Execute Language module works. I'll click the plus sign to create a new pipeline, and I'll call this pipeline Execute Python Module Demo because the language module I'm going to use is the Python module. Now I'll drag in the same dataset that we used last time, which is the automobile price data. Next, scrolling down to the bottom, you see where the language modules are, Python and R. I'll go ahead and drag over the Execute Python module. Before I connect the two modules together, you notice the Python module has 3 circles above it representing the inputs and 2 at the bottom representing the outputs. If you hover over each one, you see what they represent. The first is data frame 1, the second is data frame 2, and the third is for zip files. So depending on how many data sets you are connecting, you can leverage the Python script to do a data transformation by combining multiple data sets together in one module with your Python script. And at the bottom, you can have up to 2 different results from your Python script. So for this example, I have one data set, so I'll connect it to data frame 1, and the name data frame 1 becomes important when I write my Python script because I'll use that to call upon the data. I'll go ahead and connect these modules together, and I'll click on the Execute Python script module. And the first thing I'm going to do is click the Edit Code button on the bottom to expand the script section. And you'll notice that there are some pre-filled scripts there referencing the data frames. But we already have a script of our own which is available in the exercise files. And I'll go ahead and paste it over here. And it's a simple Python script applying some division between 2 columns in the dataset. This will then generate a new column that will tell us what the horsepower is per dollar for each car. This allows the buyer to know how much they are paying for each horsepower in the vehicle. Go ahead and press save. And now we can submit the pipeline. Once you hit submit, we'll be prompted to add a compute. And just like before, we will add our compute and press save. And hit submit again. And now we'll give it an experiment name. And I'll call mine Python experiment. And go ahead and press submit. This will take a few minutes, so I'll continue once it's completed. Now that it's done, let's take a look at what the results look like. I'll do this by right-clicking on the Python module and go to Visualize. If we scroll all the way to the right, we'll see the new column that's been added, and this is the dollar per horsepower column. And if you scroll down, you get a sense of how much the horsepower cost for each of the cars that we see in here. You might have to scroll all the way to the left to see which car this is referencing, depending on if you have a big screen to have a full real estate of this. But I'll let you take a look at this data as we conclude this module. To wrap up this module, let's take a look at what we've done so far. We learned how to define what Azure Machine Learning Designer Modules are. We also got a better understanding of it by going through scenarios of when to use them. And lastly, we also went into our Azure Machine Learning Studio and saw what it was like to create a pipeline containing modules connected to our datasets, as well as using modules that allow you to bring in custom scripts written in languages like R and Python.